and welcome back to my next video. Continuing from part 1, I invite you to join me as we now enter part 2 of this long journey through the First World War. In the previous chapter, we talked about the sudden eruption of a global conflict, the first shocks that shook Europe, the early battles that swept across the continent, and the tense and exhausting stalemate that soon settled over the Western Front. What had begun with speed and confidence quickly hardened into a war of trenches, mud, and attrition. It was a world where young soldiers on both sides discovered that courage alone could not break barbed wire, and where entire nations realized that this conflict would last much longer than they had hoped. In this second part, we widen our lens. The Great War, as it was called, did not stay confined to the fields of France and Belgium. As months rolled into years, the conflict expanded outward, pulling in old empires and rising powers, stretching itself across continents and oceans. What began as a European war grew into a global struggle shaped by ambition, fear, desperation, and the cold calculations of governments trying to survive. As an old historian looking back, I can tell you that part 2 of this story is not only about battles or troop movements. It is about the unraveling of political systems, the collision of imperial dreams, and the opening of fronts that would deepen the suffering of millions. Today, we will step into those new frontiers and examine how the war spread far beyond Europe, even though the heart of the conflict remained locked in stalemate. The first question is simple but important. Why did the war expand beyond Europe at all? The answer lies in the structure of the 19th century world. Major European powers had built enormous colonial empires across Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. These empires were not only symbols of national pride, but also sources of manpower, resources, and strategic territory. When Europe went to war in 1914, these colonies were automatically pulled in. But there was another reason. By 1915, it was clear to both sides that the stalemate on the Western Front could not be broken easily. Each alliance began searching for new fronts where they might strike a decisive blow, weaken the other side, or secure a long-term advantage. In other words, the war expanded because both sides were desperate to escape the deadlock in France. Japan was one of the first countries to act. Although far from Europe, Japan had been rising quickly as a modern power. After defeating Russia in 1905, it was eager to strengthen its influence in East Asia. When the war began, Japan joined the Allies and quickly seized German territories in the Pacific and in China. Among these gains was the Shandong region, a valuable foothold along the Chinese coast. For Japan, the Great War was less about supporting its allies and more about expanding its empire and securing its position as the dominant power in East Asia. This move would have long-lasting consequences that echoed far beyond 1918. Italy's path into the war was more complicated. Italy had originally been part of the Triple Alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary, but tensions simmered beneath the surface. Italy had long coveted territories held by Austria-Hungary, regions known collectively as Italia Irredenta. When the war began, Italy argued that it had no obligation to join because the alliance was defensive, and Austria-Hungary had initiated the conflict by attacking Serbia. The Allies then offered Italy a secret agreement known as the Treaty of London, promising generous territorial rewards if Italy switched sides. Driven by nationalism, political ambition, and frustration with its old partners, Italy entered the war against Austria-Hungary. Yet, despite high hopes, Italy soon found itself trapped in brutal mountain warfare, gaining little and suffering greatly. Across Africa, the war took on a harsher character. German colonies were surrounded by Allied territories, and the fighting there was shaped by long marches, tropical disease, and brutal supply shortages. In German East Africa, tens of thousands of African porters were forced into service by both sides. Many died not from battle, but from exhaustion, hunger, and illness. For the African population, the war was a tragedy imposed by distant empires, and its cost would be felt for generations. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire entered the conflict for reasons rooted in pride, fear, and political maneuvering. The empire had been weakened by the Balkan Wars and internal division. When Britain seized 2 Ottoman battleships that had been paid for but not delivered, resentment grew. Then, Two German warships, the Goeben and the Breslau, sailed into Ottoman waters and were absorbed into the Ottoman fleet. Enver Pasha, a powerful and ambitious leader, pushed aggressively for war. Without full approval, he ordered naval attacks on Russia, effectively dragging the Ottomans into the conflict. What followed was a series of difficult campaigns in the Caucasus, Mesopotamia, and the Sinai, but their entry also opened a vast new theater of war. Yet, despite all these new fronts, the great stalemate in Europe remained unbroken. The war had expanded across the world, but the heart of the conflict still beat stubbornly in the trenches of the Western Front. As the war dragged on and the stalemate along the Western Front refused to break, both sides turned toward new methods and new technologies in the hope of tipping the balance. What emerged in these years was a harsh evolution of warfare, a step into a more modern and more terrifying age. The First World War is often remembered for trenches and mud, but it is equally remembered for the introduction of weapons that shocked the world, reshaped military strategy, and left emotional scars on entire generations. When I look back on this period as an old historian, I see a moment when humanity crossed a line, moving from the wars of the 19th century into something far darker and far more complex. One of the earliest and most disturbing of these innovations was chemical warfare. At the Second Battle of Ypres in 1915, German forces released a cloud of chlorine gas across the battlefield. For the soldiers facing it, the experience was overwhelming. They watched a greenish mist drift toward them, carried by the wind. And at first, many did not know what it was. Then, as the gas reached their trenches, men began coughing and choking, their lungs burning with every breath. Panic surged through the lines. Some tried to flee. Others covered their faces with whatever they could find, including wet cloths and rags. Chlorine gas did not just injure the body, it broke morale. It created fear so deep that even rumors of gas could cause an entire unit to retreat. Over the course of the war, nations developed deadlier gases like phosgene and mustard gas. The latter capable of burning the skin and causing blindness. Gas masks were eventually issued, but even with protection, the psychological impact remained. Chemical warfare became a symbol of the war's cruelty, a reminder of how far nations were willing to go in their attempts to break the stalemate. Above the trenches, another new threat appeared. The Germans began using Zeppelin airships to bomb British cities. These giant floating machines moved slowly across the sky, sometimes at night, dropping explosives onto towns and neighborhoods. The damage they caused was limited compared to later bombings in history, but their true power was psychological. British civilians, many of whom had never imagined war reaching their homes, looked up in fear as the enormous shapes passed overhead. The airships were difficult to shoot down in the beginning, but as anti-aircraft guns improved and fighter planes grew more capable, the Zeppelin raids became less effective. Still, they marked the start of aerial warfare, a new domain that would shape the 20th century. Beneath the waves, Germany introduced another modern threat, the submarine or U-boat. Britain depended heavily on overseas supplies, everything from food to ammunition. German leaders understood that if they could starve Britain into submission, they might win the war without needing a breakthrough on land. Early in the conflict, U-boats targeted military ships. But as the war intensified, Germany expanded its campaign and adopted unrestricted submarine warfare. This meant that any ship heading to Allied ports, even civilian vessels, could be attacked without warning. German commanders believed this was the only way to cut off Britain's lifelines. Their submarines lurked silently beneath the ocean, launching torpedoes at merchant ships and slipping away before they could be hunted down. One of the most infamous moments of this campaign came in 1915, when the passenger liner Lusitania was struck by a German torpedo off the coast of Ireland. The ship sank quickly, taking with it many lives, including American passengers. The event shocked the world. Newspapers in the United States ran headlines condemning the attack as an assault on innocent civilians. There were disputes about whether the ship had been carrying munitions, but regardless of the truth, the sinking had a profound effect on American public opinion. It did not immediately bring the United States into the war, but it sowed seeds of anger and distrust that would matter greatly in the years to come. In response to the U-boat threat, the Allies developed new strategies. They began organizing merchant ships into convoys protected by naval escorts. This reduced the chances of any single vessel being isolated and torpedoed. They also experimented with early sonar, known then as hydrophones, which allowed ships to detect submarines underwater, though the technology was still primitive. Naval mines were deployed in key areas, creating barriers that U-boats risked hitting if they ventured too close. These countermeasures slowly turned the tide, forcing German submarines to operate with greater caution. Taken together, these innovations marked a decisive turning point in the evolution of warfare. Gas, submarines, zeppelins, and new defensive tactics transformed the conflict into something the world had never seen before. The Great War became not just a clash of armies, but a battle of technologies, a struggle to control land, sea, and sky. This escalation made the war more dangerous, more unpredictable, and more global than anything that had come before. As the war expanded across continents and technologies evolved into frightening new forms, the Balkans and Eastern Europe entered a period of deep crisis. These regions had already been unstable before 1914, marked by competing nationalisms, territorial disputes, and the fading strength of old empires. When the Great War erupted, these fault lines widened. By the middle years of the conflict, the Balkans and Eastern Europe became theaters of exhaustion, desperation, and political unraveling, revealing how fragile the old order truly was. One of the most significant developments in this region was Bulgaria's entry into the war. Bulgaria had suffered bitter disappointment after the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913. Although it had fought bravely, it lost significant territory to its neighbors, especially Serbia. National pride had been wounded, and the desire to regain lost lands remained intense. When the Central Powers approached Bulgaria with promises of territorial rewards, the offer struck at the heart of Bulgarian ambition. Aligning with Germany and Austria-Hungary was not only a strategic decision, but an emotional one, rooted in a sense of grievance and longing for restoration. Once Bulgaria joined the war, it coordinated with the Central Powers in a major offensive that eventually overwhelmed Serbia. This event would have enormous consequences for the region and for the Serbian people. The Serbian army, already exhausted after months of fighting, faced one of the most tragic episodes of the entire war. As the Central Powers advanced, Serbia had no choice but to retreat across the rugged mountains of Albania during the harsh winter of 1915 and 1916. This event became known as the Great Retreat. Soldiers and civilians alike marched through freezing conditions, starving, wounded, and often without proper clothing. Many collapsed from exhaustion. Others were lost along the narrow mountain paths. Disease swept through the columns of retreating people. For those who survived, the memory of that winter was etched permanently into their lives. Eventually, Allied ships evacuated the remaining Serbian forces to the island of Corfu, where they regrouped. It was one of the most difficult journeys any army endured during the Great War, showing a level of human suffering that still resonates more than a century later. While Serbia struggled to survive, the Western Front witnessed two of the most brutal battles in history. The first was Verdun, fought in 1916. For the German command, Verdun was intended as a deliberate strategy to break France by bleeding it dry. They believed that France would defend Verdun at any cost because of its symbolic importance. Their plan was to force the French to send wave after wave of troops into a battle designed to drain their strength. What the Germans did not anticipate was the extraordinary resilience of the French army. Verdun became a symbol of national determination. French soldiers rotated through the front lines under a system known as the Sacred Way, and they fought with a resolve that astonished the world. The phrase "Ils ne passeront pas," meaning "they shall not pass," became the rallying cry of the defenders. By the end of the battle, both sides suffered enormous losses, but the French had held the line, and Verdun entered the history of France as a testament to endurance under unimaginable pressure. Later that same year, the British attempted to relieve the French by launching a major offensive along the Somme River. The first day of the Battle of the Somme became the bloodiest in the history of the British Army. Tens of thousands of men fell within hours, victims of a failed bombardment that had not destroyed German defenses. The sheer scale of the casualties stunned the nation. Yet the Somme also marked the debut of a new machine that would become central to modern warfare, the tank. Early tanks were slow, unreliable, and often broke down, but their appearance demonstrated that technology would gradually reshape the battlefield. Even with this innovation, however, the Somme dragged on for months, consuming men and resources in a battle that changed little geographically but altered Britain's perception of the war forever. In the east, the Russian Empire was reaching its breaking point. The Brusilov offensive of 1916 was one of the most successful operations Russia conducted during the entire war. Under the leadership of General Alexei Brusilov, Russian forces broke through Austro-Hungarian lines with a level of coordination and planning that surprised even their own allies. But this success came at a terrible cost. Russia expended enormous amounts of ammunition, manpower, and supplies that it could not easily replace. As the months passed, shortages deepened. Soldiers lacked food, weapons, and even basic clothing. The strain spread beyond the battlefield and into Russian society. Strikes, protests, and anger toward the government intensified. The Brusilov offensive, though brilliant militarily, accelerated the collapse of the Russian state. By 1917, the old imperial order was crumbling, setting the stage for revolution. Thus, across the Balkans and Eastern Europe, the war did not merely produce battles. It triggered the erosion of empires, the suffering of entire populations, and the first signs that the political foundations of the continent were beginning to fracture. As the struggle intensified in Europe and the Balkans, another vast and complex theater of war unfolded across the Middle East and North Africa. This region, shaped by ancient empires, desert landscapes, and deep cultural histories, found itself pulled into the Great War not by choice, but by the ambitions and fears of outside powers. For the Ottoman Empire, already weakened by years of internal strife and military defeat, the entry into the war opened painful wounds that stretched from the Caucasus to Mesopotamia and down into the Arabian Peninsula. From my perspective as an old historian, the Middle Eastern front is one of the most revealing parts of the war because it exposes how geography, empire, and identity collided in ways that would shape the modern world long after the fighting stopped. The first major pressure on the Ottomans came from the north. Russian forces, taking advantage of their position in the Caucasus, pushed southward into Ottoman territory. This region was mountainous, cold, and unforgiving, but it held symbolic and strategic importance for both empires. Fighting there was shaped by harsh terrain and brutal winters. Russian advances threatened the Ottoman interior and forced the empire to stretch its already limited manpower across a vast frontier. The Ottomans, exhausted from previous conflicts in the Balkans, struggled to resist. Their losses in the Caucasus reverberated throughout the empire, deepening instability and fueling distrust within the government. At the same time, the British launched operations farther south, aiming to secure Mesopotamia. For Britain, this region held two major attractions. First, it contained the vital access routes to Persia's oil fields, resources that were becoming increasingly important for the Royal Navy. Second, control of Mesopotamia would weaken Ottoman authority and strengthen Britain's influence across the Middle East. Early British advances seemed promising, but overconfidence led to disaster. In late 1915, a British Indian force pushed too far up the Tigris River and became trapped in the town of Kut. Surrounded and cut off, the garrison endured months of siege, hunger, and disease. Several attempts to break through and relieve the troops failed. Finally, in 1916, the besieged forces surrendered, marking one of the most painful defeats for the British during the war. Yet defeat did not end Britain's ambitions in the region. Instead, it sparked a restructuring of strategy and leadership. Reinforcements were brought in, supply lines were improved. Commanders reassessed their earlier mistakes. With renewed energy, the British reorganized and launched a broader campaign from the south, slowly pushing northward again. This time, their efforts were more deliberate and better supported, laying the groundwork for eventual success in Mesopotamia. While these battles unfolded, a very different kind of campaign began to take shape in the Arabian Peninsula. Here, one of the most iconic figures of the entire war emerged. A British officer named Thomas Edward Lawrence remembered today as Lawrence of Arabia. Lawrence was not a traditional military commander. He did not rely on large battalions or heavy equipment. Instead, he understood the landscape, the culture, and, most importantly, the deep desire among many Arab groups to rise against Ottoman rule. With remarkable insight and empathy, he built relationships with local leaders, earning their trust and forging alliances where others might have failed. One of Lawrence's most effective strategies involved targeting the Ottoman supply network. The Hijaz Railway, which ran from Damascus to Medina, was essential for moving troops, food, and equipment across the region. Instead of trying to defeat large Ottoman forces directly, Lawrence advised and led small, mobile groups of Arab fighters who launched swift attacks on sections of the railway. They destroyed tracks, bridges, and trains, forcing the Ottomans to divert precious resources to constant repairs and security. These attacks did not aim to seize territory, but to undermine the empire's ability to wage war. Beyond sabotage, Lawrence provided vital intelligence to the British. He gathered information about terrain, troop movements, and local politics, offering insights that traditional officers often overlooked. His understanding of the tribes was equally important. Arabia was not a unified nation, but a mosaic of different groups, each with its own goals and rivalries. Through patient negotiation and genuine respect, Lawrence helped these tribes find a shared purpose in the revolt against the Ottomans. This unity, fragile but powerful, shifted the balance of power in the region. The combined effect of Russian pressure in the north, British operations in Mesopotamia, and the Arab revolt was profound. The Ottoman Empire, already stretched thin, found itself attacked from multiple directions. Supply lines were failing, morale was crumbling. The empire that had once ruled vast territories now struggled simply to hold itself together. Strategically, the Middle Eastern campaigns cracked open the southern flank of the Ottoman world, allowing Britain to gain dominance over key ports, trade routes, and eventually the gateway to oil fields that would reshape the geopolitical future. Looking back, it is clear that the Middle Eastern front was not a side story, but a central chapter in the reshaping of global politics. The collapse of Ottoman control, the rise of British influence, and the aspirations of Arab communities set in motion changes that extended far beyond 1918. In many ways, the modern Middle East was born out of these years of war, rebellion, and shifting alliances. As the war wore on into its later years, the political landscape of Europe began to shift in dramatic and irreversible ways. Nowhere was this more evident than in Russia, where the strains of war exposed deep fractures within the empire. For years, Russian soldiers had endured shortages of ammunition, food, clothing, and even basic equipment. The harsh winters only worsened their suffering. At the same time, civilians in the cities faced soaring prices and empty shelves. Long lines formed outside bakeries. Families struggled simply to survive. These hardships created a growing sense of anger and despair among the population. Compounding the crisis was the collapse of confidence in the monarchy. Tsar Nicholas II, already seen as distant and ineffective, made the disastrous decision to take direct command of the army. This left the government in the hands of advisors who lacked experience and authority. Meanwhile, the presence of Rasputin, a mystic who wielded enormous influence over the royal family, fueled rumors and resentment. Many Russians believed that the monarchy had fallen under the sway of a dangerous outsider. The credibility of the Romanov dynasty, which had ruled for centuries, was dissolving before the country's eyes. By early 1917, protests erupted in Petrograd. Strikes shut down factories. Demonstrations grew larger. Soldiers who had once been symbols of imperial loyalty began to refuse orders to disperse the crowds. The old system could no longer contain the rising tide of unrest. Within weeks, Nicholas II abdicated, bringing an end to the Romanov line. A provisional government attempted to stabilize the country, but it remained committed to continuing the war, a choice that only deepened public frustration. Later that same year, the Bolsheviks seized power in the October Revolution. Led by Vladimir Lenin, they promised peace, land, and bread, appealing to weary soldiers and desperate civilians. True to their word, they sought an immediate end to Russia's involvement in the war. This led to the signing of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in 1918, a harsh agreement that stripped Russia of vast territories but gave the new government the ability to focus on its internal struggles. With Russia's withdrawal, Germany was suddenly free to move more than 1 million soldiers from the Eastern Front to the West. This massive shift in manpower gave Germany its last real chance to win the war before new enemies arrived. While events unfolded in Russia, another development was taking shape across the Atlantic. For much of the war, the United States had remained officially neutral, though it supplied the Allies with food, weapons, and loans. American public opinion was divided. Some favored intervention, others firmly opposed it. But in early 1917, British intelligence intercepted a secret communication from Germany known as the Zimmermann telegram. In it, Germany proposed that Mexico join the war against the United States in exchange for the recovery of lost territories. British codebreakers deciphered the message and discreetly passed it to Washington. When the contents became public, many Americans reacted with shock and outrage. The idea that Germany would encourage an attack on American soil was seen as a direct threat to national security. Combined with Germany's renewed use of unrestricted submarine warfare, which endangered American ships and citizens, the Zimmermann telegram shifted American opinion decisively. In April 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. For the Allies, American entry brought not only fresh troops, but also a renewed sense of hope. For Germany, it meant that time was running out. Knowing this, Germany launched a massive offensive in the spring of 1918, hoping to defeat France and Britain before large numbers of American forces could arrive. At first, the offensive achieved startling gains. German stormtrooper units broke through Allied lines using swift, coordinated attacks, but the success could not be sustained. Germany lacked the supplies, equipment, and reinforcements needed to maintain the advance. Their best troops were depleted. Exhaustion set in. When the Allies counterattacked, supported by growing American strength, the German lines began to crumble. One by one, Germany's allies collapsed. Bulgaria surrendered first, followed by the Ottoman Empire. Austria-Hungary, torn apart by nationalism and hunger, soon followed. With its partners gone and its own people increasingly desperate, Germany had no choice but to seek an armistice. On November 11, 1918, at the 11th hour, the fighting finally came to an end. Looking back from the distance of many decades, this final phase of the war reveals the immense forces that reshaped the modern world. Russia's collapse paved the way for a new political order. America's entry signaled a shift in global power. The defeat of the Central Powers ended one era but planted the seeds of another conflict that would erupt only 20 years later. As an old historian, I believe that understanding these turning points helps us grasp the motives of nations, the fragility of peace, and the profound cost of war. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. If you wish to continue exploring history with me, I invite you to join me in the next video, where we will look deeper into the stories that shaped our world.